In the many years of Canada's existence, there have been a great many mysteries to occur within the nation's borders. This Canada Day, we'll look at 5 mysteries from Canadian history. From the mysterious fire that destroyed Canada's Parliament building, to unsolved heists of precious artifacts and a suspicious explosion that killed a notable religious leader, these are 5 obscure Canadian mysteries. Prior to November 7, 1885, Canada could not be called a united country. Though on paper the young nation stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific, the reality on the ground was much different. Between the newly added province of British Columbia and the main population centers in the east lay a vast region of prairie and mountainous terrain. In order to reach the west coast of Canada, one would need to make a long journey by sea or a similarly arduous journey by land. The United States had similar problems and had already found a solution, creating a transcontinental railway to connect the west and east coasts of the country. Prime Minister John A. Macdonald, Canada's first Prime Minister, had envisioned a similar railway to connect the nation. Though it had taken many years, had suffered numerous setbacks, and resulted in the death of a great many workers, the Canadian Pacific Railway was nearly completed. The 2 sections of the line, one headed west and the other east, met in Craigellachie, British Columbia. Before the railway could be connected, a final ceremony to commemorate the completion of the greatest feat of engineering in Canadian history would occur. As the company's president, George Stephen, was in Britain on company business, Donald Smith, the general director, would be the man to drive the last spike into the line. While it would be expected that such a momentous occasion would receive an equally great ceremony, General Manager William Van Horn believed otherwise. The CPR was in a precarious financial position, and he wished to save money by avoiding a lavish celebration. He had made his intentions clear, telling the press that if they wanted to see the event, they would have to pay their own way there. The ceremony would be attended primarily by employees of the railway, including many of the workers who had just finished the line. The last spike to be driven into the track would be no different than the 30 million others to come before it, apart from its historical significance to the nation. Despite Van Horn's intentions, there would not necessarily be a last spike. One man was not satisfied with such a humble event. Lord Lansdowne, Canada's Governor-General, had paid out of pocket for the creation of a silver-plated spike dedicated specifically for the ceremony, and planned to be present to watch it be driven into place at Craigellachie. His duties as Governor-General would foil his plans, and neither Lord Lansdowne nor his spike would leave Ottawa. The driving of the final spike would be photographed by Alexander Ross. Another photographer had been hired by the CPR, but had been unable to reach Craigellachie by the morning of November 7th. Ross had already been present at the site and had been asked to photograph the event. Photographs taken by Ross would become some of, if not the most famous photographs taken in Canadian history. By 9:22 in the morning, all was ready for Smith to drive the last spike into the track. He raised a hammer and aimed for the spike. His aim was off, striking a glancing blow and bending the spike. It was quickly pulled out of place, tossed to the side, and replaced. Smith would try again. This time his aim was true, and the Canadian Pacific Railway was complete. Before he left Craigellachie, Smith made sure to collect the bent spike, and before the attendees departed the scene altogether, the second spike, the true last spike, would also be removed in order to prevent it from being stolen by any would-be treasure hunters. After Van Horn gave a brief address to those present, he boarded a train along with Stephen and the other dignitaries. That afternoon, he would send a telegraph to Prime Minister Macdonald, informing him of the railway's completion and thanking him for his assistance in building the railway. The men then traveled west, becoming the first to travel along the CPR from coast to coast. As for the spikes, all would be preserved for their great value to the nation. The ceremonial spike belonging to Lord Lansdowne was later mounted on a granite base and given to William Van Horn. It remained in Van Horn's family until being donated to the Canadian Museum of Civilization in 2012. The bent spike was kept by Donald Smith. Smith had parts of it carved off and fashioned into decorative pins. His family would donate what was left of it to the National Science and Technology Museum in 1985. The story of the true last spike is a bit more vague. There is an unknown period of time in which the status of the spike is not mentioned. It was clearly kept safe, as it would be presented to CPR President Edward Beatty at an unknown date. The spike would be kept in his office in Montreal. There, this great artifact would remain for years. Wherever he kept it, the last spike was not in clear view. Thus, it would be many years before anyone noticed that it had gone missing. It's not even known what year it disappeared in, but it was believed to have been taken sometime in the 1930s or 40s. Later investigations would come up with the lead. Some believed that the spike had somehow ended up in the hands of a patent officer in Ottawa. It is claimed that he passed it down to his children, who had it converted into a silver-plated handle and attached to a carving knife. According to this theory, the knife may sit in a safety deposit box in Winnipeg, though no proof of this claim has ever been found. Even if we assume this claim to be true, it does not explain how the spike originally disappeared from the office in the first place, leaving the fate of the last spike unknown. The construction of Canada's Parliament building started over 7 years before the nation of Canada as we know it came into being. Ground was broken in the capital of Ottawa on December 20th, 1859, and wouldn't be fully completed until 1876. As the beautiful Gothic Revival structure was under construction, Canada would become a nation and rapidly expand, rendering the once excessively large Parliament building too small for the government's purposes. Later additions and the transfer of other government departments to different buildings in the Ottawa area would rectify this issue by 1914. The Parliament would be split into 3 buildings, referred to as the West Block, East Block, and Centre Block. The Centre Block was the largest and most striking of these buildings, and was home to the House of Commons. That year, the First World War would break out in Europe, and Canada, still part of the British Empire, would join the war. Despite being on an entirely different continent to most of the fighting, Canada was not untouched by the war. On February 2nd, 1915, Werner Horn, a German soldier stuck in the US after the outbreak of war, would be directed by German diplomats in the US to blow up a vital railway bridge on the Canadian border. He would attempt to blow up the Vanceboro Bridge, which connected the province of New Brunswick and the state of Maine. Horn would be unsuccessful, but not all were as incompetent as him. On July 30th, 1916, a colossal explosion would rock Black Tom Island in Jersey City, just across the Hudson from the Statue of Liberty. German saboteurs had snuck into a munitions warehouse located on the island. Thus, there was good reason for Canadians to fear a German attack at home, though this justifiable concern would often devolve into hysterics. On February 3rd, 1916, it was another ordinary evening in the Centre Block of Parliament. Members of Parliament were still debating the issues of the day shortly after 8:37 p.m. Despite the ongoing war, the MPs were discussing far more mundane issues. Clarence Jameson, an MP from Nova Scotia, had brought up the topic of fish prices and the disparity between the price of fish in stores versus the money paid to fishermen. He proposed an investigation into the subject. William Logie, an MP from New Brunswick, suggested that the issue be referred to the Marine and Fisheries Committee instead. While this exchange occurred in the House of Commons, a man noticed signs of a fire coming from the reading room, located elsewhere in the Centre Block. The fire would rapidly spread. The discussion of the fish prices ended abruptly as the chief doorkeeper burst into the House of Commons, telling the occupants that the reading room was on fire. To emphasize this point, thick smoke would begin to pour into the House of Commons. Those within the building would have to fight through choking smoke to escape. For some, a short delay would mean the difference between life and death. The wife of the Speaker of the House was hosting 3 of her friends on the 3rd floor. At the first sign of fire, she would rush out of the building with her children and maids. Her friends briefly delayed their evacuation to collect their valuables. Only one of them would survive the fire, jumping from a window into a net held by firemen. 5 others would die in the fire. Bowman Law, an MP from Nova Scotia, would be trapped in an office with another man. A policeman and 2 civil servants who were attempting to fight the fire were killed when a wall collapsed on top of them. Among those to narrowly escape the fire was Prime Minister Robert Borden, who escaped with the assistance of a 15-year-old page. The fire would rage out of control despite a quick response and determined effort by the Ottawa Fire Department. It would only be extinguished the following morning. The only part of the building to survive was the Parliamentary Library. During the construction of the Centre Block, librarian Alpheus Todd insisted that the library be separated from the rest of the building with fireproof iron doors. On February 3rd, the quick-thinking assistant parliamentary librarian Michael McCormick raced to secure the doors before evacuating. In the aftermath of the fire, accusations of arson would be made. Witnesses reported that there was a suspicious man in the House of Commons library shortly before the start of the fire. The editor of a Rhode Island newspaper claimed that he had been told by unnamed German officials that Parliament would burn down 3 weeks prior. He would refuse to provide any additional information or come to Ottawa for examination. During subsequent hearings, theories of arson and accidental ignition would be explored. The Ottawa fire chief was insistent on arson being the cause, but was apparently known for blaming saboteurs for every major fire in the city. The chief of the Dominion Police, in charge of security for the Parliament, insisted that the cause was accidental. He, of course, had a strong incentive to dismiss the possibility of arson. Despite his bias, the police chief's belief in an accidental ignition was not unfounded. It was noted that, despite numerous signs forbidding smoking in the reading room, smoking was a common occurrence. The building's wiring was also viewed with suspicion, though no evidence of a fault prior to the fire was found. This wouldn't be the first time that one of the Parliament buildings caught fire. On February 11th, 1897, the West Block burned down. The cause was never determined, but the primary theories included a carelessly discarded cigarettes or an issue with the heating system. In the end, the cause of the 1916 fire would never be determined. No evidence of German involvement was uncovered after the end of the war. Parliament would move to the Victoria Memorial Museum, now the Canadian Museum of Nature, until 1920, when the new Parliament building was ready to serve the House of Commons. Peter Vasilievich Verigin was born on June 29, 1859, in the town of Slavyanka in present-day Azerbaijan. Verigin was born into a group known as the Doukhobors. This was a Christian sect which believed that the traditional institutions of the church were unnecessary, preferring to live simple lives on agricultural communes instead. Their unconventional and anti-authority beliefs led to them being viewed with suspicion by the Russian government. Verigin was not an average Doukhobor, however. His family was among the elite members of the group. At the time of his birth, his cousin Peter Kalmykov was leader of the Doukhobors. Kalmykov would die in 1864, and power would be transferred to his widow, Lucaria. As Peter Verigin grew up, Lucaria Kalmykov would recognize him as a promising successor to the leadership role. In the early 1880s, she would force him to divorce his pregnant wife and began preparing him for leadership. Lucaria would die in December of 1886. A succession crisis broke out between Verigin, her intended heir, and her brothers. It soon appeared as though the charismatic Verigin would come out on top, as more and more Doukhobors sided with him in the dispute. Lucaria's brothers would meet with Tsarist officials and convinced them, possibly via bribery, that Verigin was a threat to the Russian government. He was arrested and forced into exile in Siberia for the next 15 years. During his time there, he would become fascinated by the writings of Leo Tolstoy. He would incorporate many of these ideas into his own beliefs. Verigin would re-emphasize the Doukhobors' commitment to pacifism and opposition to the Russian government. This would gain them worldwide attention and increased persecution from the Russians. Among those to publicize the Doukhobors' plight was Leo Tolstoy himself. He would write many letters to acquaintances around the world discussing the issue. Among those to be contacted by Tolstoy was Professor James Mavor of the University of Toronto. Mavor was himself acquainted with Clifford Sifton, the Minister of the Interior. Sifton was looking for settlers to immigrate to Western Canada. He was convinced to allow 7,500 Doukhobors to immigrate to Canada, including Verigin, when he was released by the Russian government in 1902. When Verigin and many other Doukhobors settled in Saskatchewan, they would soon become highly unpopular. The group's tendency to solely rely on the commune's internal labor supply and bulk purchases of goods produced outside of the local community would anger their new neighbors. Worse still were the radicals. On one occasion, Doukhobor radicals would parade naked around the town of Yorkton until the police and local residents forcibly reclothed them and threw them in jail. These radicals would come to be known as the Sons of Freedom and would cause problems for their fellow Doukhobors as well. They would destroy machines used to assist in the commune's agricultural work due to their fanatical opposition to modern technology. As a part of the group's pacifism, they had refused to become naturalized citizens, as this would open them up to military service. The Canadian government seized the group's land in Saskatchewan in 1906 after continued refusals to comply. Verigin would found a new commune in British Columbia. Named Brilliant, it would encounter many of these same problems. The group refused to send their children to public schools despite the demands of the provincial government. Verigin would resolve this issue by agreeing to send children to school, provided that religion was not taught and all Doukhobor adults would be exempt from military service. This would keep the Doukhobors out of World War I, though this would further alienate them from their neighbors who received no such reprieve. After the war, the new Soviet government would offer the Doukhobors an opportunity to return to Russia. Both the Bolsheviks and Doukhobors were oppressed by the Tsar prior to the revolution, and both shared somewhat similar worldviews. Virgin refused this offer due to the Bolsheviks' disregard for pacifism. The Sons of Freedom would continue to cause problems and would become increasingly hostile to Virgin. The move to BC also brought significant logistical issues for Virgin. The Doukhobors were previously focused in a small portion of Saskatchewan, but were now spread all over Western Canada. This necessitated the creation of a managerial class to oversee their respective communities in Virgin's absence. Of course, these managers would amass a great deal of power for themselves as well. Another consequence of the Doukhobors' widespread presence across Western Canada was the necessity of train travel to enable Virgin to reach his followers. On the evening of October 28, 1924, Virgin boarded a Canadian Pacific passenger train heading to Grand Forks, home to another Doukhobor commune. Accompanying Virgin for this 100-kilometer overnight journey were a number of other Doukhobors, both those who were part of his entourage and not. The train would travel along the line through the dark October night, seemingly yet another ordinary journey. The train continued along, following the mountainous tracks alongside Arrow Lake before heading south towards Farron, a remote station located in the middle of nowhere and used primarily for crew changes. This is precisely what happened when the train stopped shortly after the clock ticked past midnight. Shortly after 1 a.m. on the 29th, the new crew departed Farron. Minutes after pulling out of the station, one of the passenger cars was rocked by an explosion. 9 passengers would be killed in the blast. Once police and medical teams made their way to the remote wreck, it was quickly determined that Peter Virgin was among the dead. Also among the dead was John McKee, the recently elected MLA for Grand Forks. The blast was immediately viewed with suspicion by both RCMP and CPR investigators. There were numerous theories. Accidental causes were considered credible, as the coach was fitted with a gas lighting system which could have exploded. The area was also home to many prospectors and miners. It was possible that a careless prospector carried dynamite on board the train, only for it to blow up due to some accident. The suggestion of an accident was dampened when suspicious pieces were found in the wreckage. A CPR constable found the remains of a clock wired to a battery, possibly belonging to a bomb. Some theories suggested that McKee was the target. The provincial legislature was divided, with the ruling Liberal Party holding 24 of 48 seats. A new speaker was to be elected by the legislature on November 3rd. The death of McKee, a member of the Conservative Party, had the potential to make this important vote much easier for the Liberals. This theory also lost credibility when examination of the wreckage determined the epicenter of the blast to be directly underneath Virgin's seat. There was no shortage of suspects. Authorities soon believed that the culprits were from the Doukhobor community itself. The Doukhobors, in turn, blamed the government, which had been hostile to them due to the many disputes and issues they had caused during their time in Canada. Some locals were growing increasingly hostile towards the Doukhobors due to their antics and fears of communist influence. Others alleged that the Soviets had done it, angry with Virgin over his refusal to return the Doukhobors to Russia. One suspect was Peter Petrovich Virgin, the son of Virgin and the wife he was forced to divorce. Virgin was estranged from his father, hating him to the point where he once threatened to kill him. Though the junior Virgin was still in what was now the Soviet Union, he would be selected as the commune's new leader. Somewhat worryingly, he was known by the nickname of Chistyakov, a name which translates to English as either the Cleanser or the Purger. He would be much more amenable to the Sons of Freedom than his father. They were another group that had motive to kill Virgin. Despite the Doukhobors' pacifist beliefs, the Sons of Freedom had been growing increasingly violent. Starting in 1923, schools in the region began burning down in suspicious fires. This happened at the same time as some Doukhobors began to rebel against the government mandate negotiated by Virgin for their children to attend public schools. In April of 1924, Virgin's home in Brilliant was destroyed by fire. Arson was also suspected in this case. During later conflicts with the Canadian government and other Doukhobors between the mid-1940s and early 1960s, similar tactics would be used. Among the targets of the Sons of Freedom would be the Canadian Pacific Railway, and bombs would also be used in addition to arson. Investigations into the explosion would fail to find any culprits, and the case remains unsolved over 100 years later. The Montreal Museum of Fine Art was founded in 1860. By 1913, the museum was expanded with the addition of the Hornstein Pavilion. The museum's history was not uneventful, as in 1933, a pair of thieves stole 14 paintings overnight. One was destroyed by the thieves before police apprehended them and returned the remaining pieces. In 1960, a group of armed robbers attempted to break into the museum but were driven off before they could take anything. The rise of Quebec nationalism drove off many of the wealthy English-speaking patrons of the museum, worsened by the October crisis of 1970. By 1972, the aging Hornstein Pavilion was in need of renovations. Labor Day weekend of 1972 was a busy time around the world, and particularly in Montreal. On September 1st, the Bluebird Cafe would be set on fire by disgruntled patrons, killing 37. In the world of hockey, the first of 8 games in the 1972 Summit Series between Canada and the USSR would be played in the Montreal Forum, resulting in a surprise Soviet victory. The following games would be watched closely until the end of the month, when the Canadians defeated the Soviets in a close final match. The Munich massacre would occur on September 5th, as Palestinian terrorists murdered 12 Israeli athletes participating in the 1972 Summer Olympics in Germany. Under the shadow of these greater events, 3 men approached the museum during the early morning hours of September 4th. One of the men would climb a tree beside the Hornstein Pavilion and carefully lower a ladder down from the roof to his accomplices. The roof of the pavilion was fitted with a number of skylights. Normally, these skylights were fitted with alarm systems to prevent break-ins, but due to the ongoing renovations, the system covering part of a skylight was disabled. The men, clad in ski masks and armed with a shotgun and at least one revolver, lowered a rope through the skylight and entered the museum. Around 1:30 a.m., one of the 3 security guards inside the building encountered the robbers. One of the robbers fired a warning shot and the guards surrendered. The other 2 were subsequently overpowered by the robbers. They were bound and gagged while one of the robbers watched over them. None of them had been able to raise the alarm prior to this point. The other 2 robbers got to work gathering the paintings and other artwork held in the museum. They would steal works by various famous artists and prepared to remove them from the building. At first, they planned to leave via the skylight, rigging a pulley system to haul their loot up to the roof. They abandoned this plan, instead deciding to bring the art to the museum's loading dock and take it away in the museum's panel van. The thieves would make their first and only mistake when they inadvertently tripped an alarm on a side door. The men grabbed everything they could before running out of the building into the streets of Montreal. The thieves ran away with 18 paintings and 39 pieces of jewelry, valued at around $2 million at the time. Police investigations would start later that morning. It would be learned that 2 of the thieves spoke French while one spoke English. This was interesting, as on August 30th, a lakefront home in Oka was broken into by 3 men with a similar description, who proceeded to steal expensive artwork from the house. This highly specific and accurate knowledge of the renovations being performed on the museum suggested the thieves had inside knowledge, either obtained from museum staff or construction workers involved in the renovation work. No proof of this inside connection was ever found. A few days after the robbery, a man contacted the museum and told them to send someone to a phone booth near McGill University. The museum's security director would go to the booth and received a call telling him to check a cigarette pack nearby. Inside, he would find a pendant that had been taken by the thieves. In late October, the museum would receive an envelope marked Port of Montreal, which contained photographs of the stolen art. The reference to the Port of Montreal may have connected the case to the West End Gang, an Irish crime syndicate that operated around Montreal's port area. Nothing would come from this clue. They demanded $500,000 in exchange for the return of the art. The museum's director was able to negotiate the price down to $250,000 and convinced them to surrender a painting to prove the artwork was still in the thieves' possession. They subsequently directed the museum staff to visit a locker in a nearby train station. There, the security director would find one of the stolen paintings. The museum worked with the Montreal police to catch the thieves. They arranged for a meeting to be held with the thieves to hand over another painting in exchange for money. An undercover officer was sent instead of a museum employee. This was foiled when a police cruiser unrelated to the case passed by the meeting place, scaring off the thieves. They would no longer cooperate with any attempts to recover the artwork. Investigations would eventually peter out, and the remaining pieces have never been found over 50 years later. One further clue would be found in the following years. Detective Alain Lecourcier specialized in art crimes while employed by the Montreal Police Department. During the 1990s, he would take a look at the case himself. In 1998, while attending an art exhibition, he met another man who had been attending an art school in Montreal at the time of the theft. The two struck up a conversation and eventually got to the topic of art thefts. This man, who is referred to by the pseudonym Smith, knew a great deal about the heist, including details not released to the public. Upon further investigation, it was revealed that Smith had purchased a home and carpentry shop shortly after graduating and had made a hobby of collecting classic cars. Smith had no concrete explanation for how he had become so wealthy so soon after graduating. Coursier suspects that Smith may have been one of the thieves but was unable to find any solid evidence. Smith would pass away in 2017. The Montreal Museum of Fine Arts would not necessarily learn its lesson from the 1972 theft. On September 3, 2011, a man posing as a visitor would quietly smuggle an ancient relief out of the museum. The piece had been put on display without a protective case. The same man would return in October of the same year and successfully stole a Roman marble bust that was displayed under similar conditions. The thief was never caught or identified, and only the relief was recovered. Prior to February 19, 1996, the $2 denomination of Canada's currency came in the form of a paper bill. In 1995, it was decided that it would be replaced by a brand new coin. The new $2 coin would feature a portrait of Queen Elizabeth and a depiction of a polar bear standing on an ice floe. The coin was unique in that it comprised of two different metals. The outer ring was made of nickel, while the interior piece was made of aluminum bronze. The new coin would be known to Canadians as the toonie. This was in reference to the $1 coin, which prominently featured a loon and was commonly referred to as the loonie. These early toonies encountered a few technical issues related to the use of two metals, creating misshapen coins that would go on to become valuable collector's pieces. Coin collectors weren't the only ones to take an interest in the coins as they began to enter circulation. On July 21st, 1.5 million toonies were packed into a tractor trailer that was sitting at the Canadian National Railway's Turcotte Yard, a train yard located south of central Montreal. As the lunch hour approached, workers at the yard left their posts. While they were enjoying their lunch break, an unknown number of thieves entered the yard undetected. Of the hundreds of containers and trucks sitting unattended in the yard, the thieves hopped inside the truck carrying the toonies and drove it out of the yard via an emergency exit. The missing truck wasn't noticed at first. It was later found abandoned near a Coca-Cola factory. The truck had been completely emptied of its cargo. Police were skeptical of the chances of success with regards to finding the stolen coins. The toonies did not receive any serial numbers or other methods of tracking. Due to the nature of the theft, there appear to have been no witnesses. It seemed unlikely that the thieves would break into a busy train yard in broad daylight and happen to find a truck carrying $3 million worth of coins by pure luck. An inside job was suspected but not proven. No arrests were ever made, and the best the Montreal police could do was send out a nationwide alert advising financial institutions and other police departments to be on the lookout for anybody trying to make large purchases with only toonies. I hope you found these Canadian mysteries interesting. This was a shorter video that I decided to put out on this Canada Day while I prepare to work on larger projects. I have 6 larger projects planned that I hope to have out before the end of the year. I was originally going to do 5, but while researching the American Airlines Flight 6780 video, I found a 6th case that I found quite interesting. I'll need to create 6 aircraft models for these videos. Design work for one is already finished, but I'll still need to make paint masks, 3D print it, and then paint it. Design work for the second is about half finished, just need to redo the fuselage and add an interior. Some of the 3D printing files are already prepared. The third and fourth will be built entirely from scratch, but are small, simple, and I won't be adding an interior or landing gear due to their size, which should help reduce work. The fifth one will be built entirely from scratch except for the engines. This one will have landing gear and an interior, so that one will take some time to get finished. Same for 6, which will be even larger than the 5th. So far, I've got all the info I'll need to make all the models, and I'll be working on them by the time this video is out. Hopefully, I should have a couple of these models in a completed state within a few months. In the meantime, I'll try to have a video out at least once a month. For now, I wish you a happy Canada Day, and, well, I have some models to make.